So for more difficulties faced by African Americans and Latinos in their journey to own a home and what can be done to address these changes, we're now turning over to a panel of experts. So please join me in welcoming on stage Andre Perry, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. Mr. Perry's research focuses on race, structural inequality, and economic inclusion. We will also be joined by Walda Yon, Chief Housing Officer at the Latino Economic Development Center. Ms. Yon brings over a decade of experience working with the Latino community on home ownership counseling and affordable housing prevention today's discussion. Also joining us is Anton Thompson, Executive Director of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the largest organization of African American real estate professionals in the United States. Mr. Thompson has focused his career on championing fair housing and community reinvestment by local and national financial institutions. And lastly, Jim Tobin, Executive Vice President of the National Association of Home Builders. Moderating today's panel discussion is Raphael Bernal, a staff writer with The Hill. Raphael, take it away.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Should be a fun conversation. Let's sort of start from the ground floor. Andre, start with you. What are the biggest obstacles for minority first-time home buyers? They make the choice. They say, it's time, and then what happens?
Well, I would say the first barrier is the sort of lack of investment on the federal government's part to invest in Black people, Black and Latino people. Remember that the home ownership boom after the Second World War especially occurred because of federal infusion of cash into potential home buyers. And from that moment on, you saw a rise of white homeowners and wealth builders that still endures today. There's no reason to think why we can't have more home buyers from Black and brown communities if we provide that infusion or boost from the federal government. We constantly talk about giving people training and running them through programs, and all those things are needed. But you won't see growth unless you have a significant infusion of federal revenue into home buyers that have been divested from federal policy.
Now, where would you put that infusion? Who would get that money?
Well, in my work, we look at. I did a recent research project that looked at the devaluation of housing assets in Black communities. We controlled for education, crime, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found that in Black communities, homes are worth 23% less than in white communities. And that equates to about $48,000 per home, about $156 billion in lost equity. And so in Black communities, we know that in those geographic areas where Black people live, we need to find ways via tax credit or via direct, some type of loan program, because folks in those communities are also largely renters. There's a lot of people struggling to get in the home buying market. We're trying to do workarounds because of our constitutional prohibitions to give to Black people and brown people. But we know where they are. And we have got to find geographically find a way to infuse cash in those areas.
Now, Waldo, with what we have right now, like supposing we would get that money, before getting that, when a Black or Latino home buyer says, okay, I'm not going to go straight to the bank because I'm afraid of going to the bank, or I don't have a credit card, or all these reasons, and they go to an institution like yours, What is the fear that you hear most? What do you hear that they don't know how to do? Their biggest obstacle.
Yeah, well, we see every day when we are meeting with our clients that they have a lot of fears and a lot of miscommunication from the formal financial system, and they don't know how the process works. They don't have the enough education in the home buying process, so they don't know what is the first step. They don't know if they can receive assistance for the down payment or closing costs, or if there are programs that can help them. So one of the biggest challenges and obstacles is a lack of information and education for the community, for the Latino and minority communities, to empower them so they can take an informed decision, and they can use all the resources that are available in their area.
And how quickly, from the moment they walk in, supposing somebody who's in the possibility of buying a home, they walk in, they have no idea how to do it, which, by the way, it is a mystery. I don't, like, even renting is sometimes a mystery to anyone. From that moment they walk in, how long does it take you to take them from the moment where they're, I don't know, to the moment where they're like, oh, I can sign that paper, I can get that home?
Well, first of all, I can give you an appointment so you can come and learn about the home buying process, please. It's free. And everything is depending on their individual situation. If there is a Latino person that they don't have established credit history, if they haven't been in the country less than 2 years, or they've been here for 10 or 15 years, they have credit, but they have some things that they need to work with. So it's based on their individual situation, but I will say an average of 2 to 3 years to prepare them to get to the point that they are mortgage ready and that they have enough savings, that they have created an emergency fund, and they have applied for any down payment assistance that exists in their area.
So, Antoine, from the process side, what can be done to increase transparency, to make that time shorter, to make it easier?
Well, there are a number of things. I think education is definitely an issue, promoting housing counseling, making more awareness about it. If you come from a community, I'm originally from Buffalo, the black ownership rate is 27%. So, 7 out of 10 people you come in contact with are not homeowners. That's a tremendous barrier in terms of the knowledge gap that exists. And if you come from a community where the perception is that when you sit in front of a white loan officer, they're going to assume that you're not ready. So that process can be very intimidating. It can be overwhelming. And so we've got to do more to educate people. We've got to make home ownership a high priority for local, state, and federal elected officials and public policymakers, and reducing the time that it takes to get through the home buying process, particularly for those people who are seeking a FHA or a conventional mortgage. That process can be long, it can be intimidating, and again, if you come from a community that's been historically discriminated against, it can be an overwhelming process.
You bring up the issue that is very often the elephant in the room, and so we can talk about the structural misgivings all we want, but, and this is an open question for whoever wants to tackle it, can we measure to what extent structural issues are driving home ownership down, and to what extent bias is?
Absolutely. The National Association of Real Estate Brokers, we're the oldest African-American real estate association in the country. We put out a report every year called The State of Housing in Black America. We're working on our 2019 report. We analyze the loan approval and denial rates in America based on the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and we document how these policies, whether it's loan level price adjustments, which did not exist before the crisis, where they add additional points and fees on loans that disproportionately impact African Americans. We document that every year. So we're not just in the emotionalism. We look at how these policies and lack of good policies, outdated credit score models that are old as flip phones, that are still used to provide access to mortgages. We document these every single year.
So is there a number? There's a statistic that in research for this surprised me. Out of the 100 cities with the largest black population, only 3 cities have a home ownership gap of less than 20%.
Yes.
Is there a number that you guys use to in your organization to illustrate this issue as strongly as that number?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look at whether you look at the population based on our demographics, whether you look at the fact that in most cities across America, every time a black person applies for a loan and a white person applies for a loan, African Americans are denied on typically 1.5 to 2 times the rate of whites. And when we talk about setting that benchmark, you can be in a majority black city like Baltimore and the home ownership rate is lower, Buffalo, and you can have black mayors, et cetera. So we need to really, the numbers tell a lot, and the policies are really are not in sync with the population. So you have lenders that are not doing enough. You have a HUD program that needs to be more aggressive in promoting home ownership. Right. I mean, I think, you know, I don't know the last time that HUD has really become more aggressive in promoting home ownership since like they had the home ownership zone in the 90s.
And so, I just very quickly, not only in lending is there bias, but we know from the research that from appraisals, there's bias in appraisals. There's bias in real estate agent behavior as well. We're still directing black people to some communities and not others. But we also have to remember that home ownership does not occur in a bubble, in isolation. Discrimination in employment impacts your ability to produce the revenue to ultimately buy a home. And we know that folks, black and brown people who call for a job are less likely to get callbacks. And so all of these things sort of contribute to a lack of ability to buy a home.
Jim, let me bring you in with this. To what extent do you believe housing availability? We heard in the previous interviews there's very different conditions in Detroit and San Francisco, for instance, or Cleveland was brought up. They're very different situations. To what extent is availability also becoming an issue?
Well, I think supply is across the board, whether it's San Francisco, New York, and rural parts of America. Housing supply is really what's driving the affordability problem that we have today. We're simply not building enough homes. We've seen the cost of regulation on a home, whether it's single family, it's just over 25% of the cost for the home is directly attributable to regulation at the federal, state, and local level. For an apartment, it's over 33%. Same thing, regulatory issues. What can we do on the federal level is something we're always working on at NAHB, but we really think that it's a local level issue. It's trying to change these policies about where you can build, what you can build, making sure that when we talk about home ownership, and we have to also talk about rental too, right? That's part of the entire housing pipeline. For, as I think Congressman Cleaver said, some people, I guess it was his cousin particularly, shouldn't be allowed to own a house or even given a house. So for us, it's about making sure that pipeline works, whether it's rental and even at the affordable end, market rate, and then all the way up to single family buyers. It's all about putting more product into the marketplace and driving prices down.
Do you feel there's a particular geographical location, a city or state, that has done a good job as opposed to where do the contrasts lie? Because I mean, I think my example of Detroit versus San Francisco is a little bit too on the nose.
Well, I think San Francisco seems to be the poster child for everything that's wrong with housing right now, and so no offense to anybody from San Francisco, but South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina in particular, has done some really good things over the last couple of years to clean out that regulatory underbrush, to put more types of housing in the market, and also they're attracting jobs in South Carolina. I mean, that's the other thing. I heard the previous panel about dropping large employers into an area that's not prepared to house those employees. So if you want to attract businesses and if you want to attract capital, you're going to need to show that you've got the housing that can support thousands of new people moving into a community, and not only just housing, affordable housing for their employees.
Unpacking that, one of the things you brought up was rental. Andre, do you believe, or have you seen that the same inequities of bias apply to the rental market as they do to the purchase market, or is it different?
Oh, absolutely. And just to go back, single-family home zoning was a direct response to keep Black people out of certain communities. And so so when you're looking for proposals, look to Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they're creating a new zoning model that is more inclusive than your single-family home model. But also, you see the same biases when folks are looking to get an apartment. And so when folks are applying, and we have lots of data to support this, that when folks apply over the phone, they're getting interest. When they show up, they somehow along the way, their application is denied. But what is clear is that we need affordable homes, period. The idea that homes are going to be a wealth builder, that is going away some in particular areas. But we need in every community, and I prescribe to that notion that housing is a fundamental right, that people have a right to live in places, and you see this right being played out in places like DC, where former Black residents who were discriminated against have a hard time buying into the city that they've been in for a long time, and now they're being pushed out systemically in areas that are farther away from jobs, from the job hubs, farther away from the educational centers. And so we need to figure out new ways to have affordable homes, particularly in your cities where there's intense racial integration of some sort or diversity. We need to figure out ways to include economic diversity and solidify homes in those places.
I'm gonna pump the
clap for
brakes
that.
before we're gonna get into. I assume you're about into gentrification and mixed housing, because I mean that is the next thing that comes up. But you mentioned one thing. I want to ask you, Walda, real quick. Latinos lost more equity in 2008 than any other group, followed closely by African Americans. So I think that is a shared experience among the two communities. Did they lose trust? Did the people who walk into your office lose trust in home ownership as a means of wealth creation?
Yes, definitely. The Latino community was I would say, the biggest community that took this hit impact for all the foreclosures happening in, I can speak for the area, in Prince George County, Manassas in Virginia, Woodbridge in Virginia. So in that time, it was when we saw more Latino families buying houses in the area. The percentage of homeownership among the Latino community was high, really high in that moment. And right now, the housing counseling agencies, we are having a lot of troubles creating that trust again in the community, because we still have some generations that have been here for 20 or 30 years, that they are established, they have a stable income, they have established their credit history, but they don't trust that they are going to be doing a good decision. That how about if they buy a house today and then in 3 months we are going to have another financial crisis? So definitely the trust in that investment, in that wealth creation tool among the Latino community is very low at this moment.
If I could, I just want we do have to change the narrative about the importance of home ownership. We don't market home ownership enough to Black communities. Since the founding of America and post-slavery, African Americans have been trying to become homeowners. right at with 40 acres and a mule. The government understood that black people should own land. But we've always been in this situation of trying to get the land and then land being hustled away from us, either through sharecropping, through outright non-lending to black communities, whether it's redlining or predatory loans. And so, yes, we've got to shift the narrative. We've got to make sure that internally and externally, inside the community and outside, that we talk about this dream of home ownership that strengthens families, that improves health outcomes, educational outcomes, and the fact that many of our, over 40% of small business owners start in the home. So we've got to tell that story more about the socioeconomic benefits of home ownership that African Americans have been pretty much shut out through most of our experience post-slavery.
Now, let's get into, into gentrification. I had an interesting experience. I don't know if anybody else noticed, but there were two members of Congress from New York, very well-known these days, AOC, and Peter King. And they have a very different experience of gentrification. Peter King was talking about American cities, and they were specifically talking about New York before the process of gentrification. The New York City in receivership and sort of that dangerous vision of New York. And he saw it as a positive. It had gone from a very unsuccessful city to what he sees as a very successful city. And she, from her generational aspect, she's looking at it, all my neighbors got kicked out of their houses. And in a way, they're both right. Because they're both pointing at specific. Now, is there a midpoint here? Does anybody want to pick that one up?
Yeah, see, I think part of the thing is, I used to chair the Community Development Committee when I was on the city council in Buffalo. And I can remember having these aggressive fights in the early 2000s about the fact that we would invest, we would bond, a lot of cities still do this, bond millions of dollars every year to demolish houses, right? But then they spend maybe $500,000 to $1 million rehabbing houses. Then in these same neighborhoods, when African Americans live there, they can't get homeowners insurance. It's very difficult to get a loan to rehab your house. But meanwhile, when whites come in, they're able to get that mortgage. They're able to get that acquisition loan to fix up their house. And then sometimes the city provides these incentives to try to get different mixed income people into these areas. And so we look at economic stimulation, right, to attract others to come in. But when the folks that live there, we're not as creative nor robust in making sure that the policies and the resources get to those communities, whether it's police protection, housing rehab, parks and playgrounds, arts and cultural facilities, and small business services, get there in an abundant way when black and brown people live in there. And you put on top of that the loan disparities for small business and home ownership. That's your gentrification.
Is there an American city that has gotten gentrification right?
No, but I want to be clear, gentrification is a bad thing. That you hear this all the time, that the only thing worse than gentrification is no gentrification. I mean, that verbal waffle is crazy. I mean, no, when you invest in everyone equitably, you don't have gentrification. You don't have people being priced out. A category of people being priced out. So yes, home ownership. When you have the ability to own a home, you reap the benefits of economic growth. When you have the ability to own a business, you're not gentrifying, you're welcoming people coming in. It's when folks don't have or have a lesser ability to own a home, have a lesser ability to get the business loan. That's where you see people being pushed out. But there is nothing wrong with people wanting more people to come into a city. However, it is absolutely horrible when you see black and brown people categorically pushed out of a community. Not only, and poor people in the main. If you live in San Francisco, it is, you cannot be a teacher and live in San Francisco. If you live in parts of DC, It is hard to just be a regular day-to-day nurse, teacher, or work in the institutions we're in. And so for me, we need to stop this, the discrimination that leads to people not having the ability to establish place. Because if you don't have a home, it is very hard for you to be a citizen in this country.
No, but before we skip through property taxes, I would say skip through because we're going to be short on time at some point. Jim, I noticed in the interview Bob Cusack had with the Secretary of HUD, Ben Carson, the Secretary said, public-private partnerships. That's the way. That's what's going to solve it. He seemed to think that was, if not the magic bullet, I don't want to put words in his mouth, the key to resolving the housing issue. Is that how you see it from your perspective?
Well, it's multifaceted. I mean, there's no one silver bullet. Public-private partnerships aside, they're an important part of what we do. But I believe it's market-driven. I believe it's. We were talking earlier about cities that are trying to make sure that not everybody has the same opportunity. There's cities across this country that are putting design standards in place to drive up the cost of housing, specifically to keep those people out of their communities, and that's something that we fight vehemently against. But we have to watch out for exactly that kind of. We talked about local regulations. That's one of the worst types of local regulations we need to fix. We need to increase incomes. African Americans have of all the demographics from homeownership, African Americans have the lowest incomes. You need to, if you can raise your income to afford a home, and then we drive the cost of affordability, I guess affordability up, not down. You're going to provide these opportunities, but it's across the board. It's going to take local regulations deciding that they want to attract more people and have an affordable housing product, whether it's through incentives or cleaning up the regulations that are driving up incentives. We need to raise. So we talked about wages. We need labor supply. We need to train more people to build the homes that we need in this country, and those are really good paying jobs. I mean, it's across the board and across this city of all the federal regulatory. They need to help solve this problem from here by encouraging state and local governments to follow suit.
And that's what I was getting at earlier, that it's imperative that we make this a public policy priority because of the social economic consequences of not doing so. I just want you to think about this, that last year Urban Institute put out a study that talked about that there's over 1 million, almost 2 million black millennials across the country that make over $100,000 a year, and they're in about 10 markets, and this is one of them, and they're renting apartments. So it's not just income. Income is a barrier. But we have these black millennials, almost 2 million, that make over $100,000 a year that should be homeowners. So yes, we have some barriers, both real and perceived, but we also have to change the narrative as well. And that's why this fall our association will be really doubling down on trying to focus on black millennials.
That's a great point. The demographics for homeownership in the country are only getting larger. Right? Yep. If you think the problem's bad now on housing and housing affordability and supply, it's only getting worse because Gen X and the millennial generation, they're the most diverse two generations we've had in generations. Or ever, that's right. And so if we're going to solve that problem of creating a supply and opportunity for those two generations, they are the next big wave on ownership. We've got to solve that problem starting now, not waiting for those generations to crash on the shore of communities in the next 10 years.
Well, as we hear, the next question is going to be on property taxes, so get that one ready. As we hear about that, start getting your questions ready. In about 2 minutes, we're going to start taking questions from the audience, and we'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. So, on property taxes, and I'm going to leave this one open again. I've lived in Chicago and Washington, D.C. since I moved to this country. Property taxes are a gigantic part of gentrification in both those cases. They were used, they increased and they pushed people out. I don't get to say whether they were used that way or not. Do you believe they were purposely used that way by cities gentrifying? Were people pushed out with property taxes?
I don't know about that because property taxes are also an issue in small municipalities where there was tremendous white flight. And so the Fergusons of the world, the Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, the East Clevelands, they saw lots of people move out. They still have services they have to provide. Without, the only way to make up for the loss of people is to increase property tax. We've got to find a way to generate revenues and to provide services for people. And one of the reasons why, in my housing devaluation report, one of the things that I wanted to point out, whereas in Black communities housing prices are lower, you're robbing municipalities of that revenue. If housing prices are off, you take away money from policing, from schools, from infrastructure. And so this tax issue is, it's all, taxation is a big thing, but there are so many issues involved in this that are connected to it. And I generally believe that we got to deal with those connective tissues.
So one thing I would talk about from my state and legislative experience is that you often have a strange situation around the tax issue, especially for African Americans. So in many cities and towns across the country, you can challenge your assessment. And so in one aspect, as Andre is talking about, you have the situation where African American properties are undervalued in terms of when they are appraised. And then you have another extreme where African American properties are overassessed because what they assess for and what they're appraised for are not one and the same. And so you have in some communities where African Americans don't challenge their assessments enough. There's a lot of misinformation and education about the importance of challenging your assessment. Whereas in middle-class white area, many of them that I represented when I was a state senator, they would challenge it every year, get attorneys, et cetera. So you do have some pushing out as a result of the increase of values. However, I just think we need to I think one of the solutions is, at least from our association, we do need more Black appraisers. They're like almost a dinosaur like Black architects. We need more Black appraisers.
Well, with that, I think if there are any questions, I see one right there, gentleman standing up, and we'll try to get to all of you.
Hi, Leon Peace in Washington, D.C. My question is, what opportunities do you see that the opportunity zones present to deal with this issue?
I think that the opportunity zones have a lot of potential. I think they're bringing attention to local communities, particularly inner city areas. I think part of, though, we need to make sure our state housing finance agencies, the local HUD offices, our city and county development people, and particularly a lot of those community stakeholders at the local level are more engaged in that, and that this is not just a commercial real estate transaction. The opportunity, the capital is coming in, and how do you create that multiplier effect to transform neighborhoods? The other thing that we need to look at is how do we make sure that as we do developments, how do we put African American and Latino and other minority groups in condos and other things that can put them on the path of home ownership? Because home ownership does not always have to be single family rental. It could be co-ops, it can be a whole host of other things as we do these major these tall buildings and old adaptive reuse projects in some of these urban centers. Let's be more creative, but we've got to get more people paying attention to opportunity zones.
Yeah, I would agree on that, Leon. I think that they hold great potential, and I think as the regs are rolled out, I think one of the recent regs came out was there's a finite window that you have to work in the opportunity zone, but they've actually relaxed it that if your project slows down because of local red tape, you're not going to get penalized. So I think they're trying to make sure they maximize the potential here. And my fear is they expire, and not too long ago. How do you make sure that investors and developers in these areas have the certainty to keep these projects going? I mean, they hold great, as you said, great potential. But the proof's going to be in the pudding on these, and we got to get it right.
But we also don't have enough black and brown fund managers or people with their own opportunity funds. You know, I generally believe that when you invest in property and not people, you get gentrification. That too often we invest in these structures, and it never leads to wealth building. So I'm more interested in opportunity zones in the potential of building wealth, but that requires direct investment in the developers who happen to be black and brown, in the projects that are managed by black and brown people, not just in areas where there are black and brown people. And so that's where I see the potential, but I also see the likelihood of things not rolling out the way we would like.
Let's package two questions. The gentleman right here, and there's a lady back there. Make them quick so we can try to get an answer for both of them.
Alejandro Becerra, National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Ed Pinto of the American Enterprise Institute has called for the expiration of the mortgage badge. He claims that the mortgage badge is a major contributor of the current high prices in housing. He alleges that works to the disadvantage of first-time home buyers. Since the mortgage badge allows lenders to make loans for people with higher debt-to-income ratios of 43%, as long as they have compensating factors, why do you agree or disagree with Mr. Pinto's efforts to have the mortgage patch expire?
Okay, we're going to quickly package that with one more. I think there was one on the left side. Actually, you can start answering that.
Yeah, I'll jump right into that. So, well, number one, I disagree with many things that Mr. Pinto says. Not everything, but many things. The mortgage patch, just like loan level price adjustments, are things that we need to look at the mortgage patch in terms of seeing how we can continue to make sure that we can get more African Americans and other minority groups into home ownership. We also need to deal with the issue of this loan level price adjustments, risk-based pricing that did not exist, which is pricing African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans and Native Americans out of home ownership. That's a fixable problem. We don't need Congress to do that. That can be done through a regulatory process, through FHFA, which is the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And yes, we need to address the patch, but we also need to take care of about 3 or 4 other things, part of housing finance reform. And 203K is another thing that he does not talk about that we need to look at, because that can help people in Cleveland, Baltimore, and Buffalo, Kansas City, St. Louis, a number of cities to help people with acquisition rehab. We need to modernize the HUD 203K program too.
And very, very quickly.
Hi, Anna Tiger, Tax Foundation. I was curious as to whether you see the mortgage interest deduction as an asset to minority communities in home purchasing, especially given the recent expansion of the standard deduction.
Yeah, it's. I think what we knew was going to happen after in tax reform and now after is that the mortgage interest deduction is now nothing more than a deduction for people at the high end of the economic spectrum and people who have expensive homes. And so it is no longer that first-time home buyer, middle class deduction, or sorry, incentive that it used to be. From NHB's perspective, we believe that it's time to look at a different way to incentivize. Housing has always been incentivized in this country, maybe at varying degrees, but it's always been part of the tax code for a reason, because homeownership is good for the social fabric of America. It's time that we need to look at the mortgage interest deduction, whether it's really doing what it was supposed to do, and maybe look at a different incentive like a tax credit, maybe something that incorporates property taxes, because we've seen that same erosion with the SALT cap at $10,000. Again, we have to help that first and second rung of home ownership, not the high end.
So from the NARAP perspective, we strongly support the mortgage interest deduction. We do think it needs to be strengthened. We need to add additional incentives to promote home ownership. Congressman Gregory Meeks is introducing a bill for us called the American Dream Down Payment Savings Plan, which would mirror the 529 where people can save tax-free for home ownership. The other thing is that that Mr. Tobin talked about earlier is that, and I want to expand upon this, America has always provided incentives to access land, whether it was through home grants, homestead grants in the 1800s to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA in the 1930s and 1940s. And so we've got to be aggressive. If we want to level the playing field, we got to be intentional. One of the guys that from Wells Fargo, we were at a panel a couple weeks ago, and he said we've got to be intentional about increasing home ownership. And I think the federal government, the state, and local governments must be intentional about increasing the rate of black home ownership. White home ownership would not be where it is today over the last 200-300 years of this country without the intentional efforts of the federal government to help acquire land, develop land, and boost people up and prop people up to become homeowners.
Well, I mean, we're a bit over time, but I think that's a good place to end this. Please thank our panelists and have a great day.